Okay. All right, let me move some stuff around here. Oh my God. I'm gonna move Super Chief. So we can talk about Super Chief Limited. Oh, this thing has an interesting situation going on here. The original plan with Super Chief Limited was I was going to work on this bike at the same time that I was working on the Chief Dark Horse. But once I realized I had to take the motor out of the Chief Dark Horse and rebuild that bike and strip it all the way down to the frame, especially since I was going to have it powder coated, I didn't want to touch this bike until that other bike was done. However, I started to tear into this bike because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to have any surprises and that it was just going to be a simple fix. But it has turned out to not be a simple fix on this motorcycle. In fact, it is probably going to be one of the more difficult jobs outside of the Chief Dark Horse because this bike has a bent frame. The Chief Dark Horse did not have a bent frame, but this one 100% has a bent frame, and it has completely halted this entire project, aside from another issue with the motor that is very similar to the Chief Dark Horse. I'm gonna take the tank off of here. It's not bolted down and it's not connected or anything. I want to show you guys this because it is a very unfortunate situation because this was not supposed to be this way, but this is simply how it's turned out. So you got the neck of the frame all the way down to the suspension. I realized I had a problem when I was taking the front forks off of this, that the neck of the frame, or the spine of the frame here, as it comes up to the neck, you can see right when it gets to the neck right here, right by the bearing, it tends to veer off like a curve. Because the impact of the bike, it somewhat twisted this neck, and that is reason why we have like bent up starters, and the space between the header and the frame is not adequate. And we got a whole bunch of other stuff going on here because originally the tire was pushed into the frame, which is why all that stuff down is all jumbled up. It's honestly off by maybe, I don't know, 10 degrees, but right as it's coming up here, it tends to start to curve this way. It's really hard to see, but it's definitely bent. What made this like 100% the case, this tank would not fully sit flush on this frame. Even after trying to maneuver it, I figured like, hey, maybe it was bumped out of line or something. But no, it's just straight up, the neck of the frame is bent, so the tank will not fully sit flush like it's supposed to. So you're probably wondering like, Brandon, okay, what are you gonna do now that you realize the tank is, or rather the frame is bent? Ah, come on. Stupid hooks. There we go. Well, we're gonna have the frame repaired. Yeah. It was supposed to be the easier of the two because visually when you looked at it, you thought, oh, it just needed a front end, like forks and tire and a floorboard and maybe a starter. But the more layers I peel back, the more I realize it's even worse. So you have a left frame rail right here. This is what basically holds the motor in, or rather, you have to take that off to pull the motor out from the side or lift the frame off of the motor, right? That frame rail is bolted into the motor. Well, when this bike was in an impact, one of those bolts ripped off into the motor, sort of. It's not leaking from that. Well, so the first Chief Dark Horse, the impact caused like one of the bolts to puncture the motor and basically cause a leak from the inside. So I had it welded from the inside. But on this one of the bolts ripped the bottom of the crankcase down. So the rail pulled it down. So now you have like split, like where, it's kind of hard to explain, where the bolt goes in, the bottom of the crankcase where you like, it pulled that piece of metal down. So when you screw it in, the bolt has nothing to screw into because it pulled the threads down. So it didn't pull the part where the oil comes out, it pulls the bottom of it under the bolt. So because of that, I had to have the motor welded just like the first one. but I shouldn't have to take the motor apart to do this because it is not an oil leak. It is simply something that where the motor mounts into. So this motor will have to come out just like the Chief Dark Horse's motor had to. The only downside is I have to either learn how to weld or find somebody to come here to weld, because trying to take this entire motor to them and say like, hey, I just need this part welded, and you're trying to lift this 400 or probably 200-pound motor up to do that, I don't know. That's probably gonna be more trouble than it is, so I may end up getting a TIG welder and trying my hand at welding this, or finding a friend that can come and weld this for me here in the garage so I don't have to take the motor somewhere. So the side note is to that is the starter, being that it's bent, there's a good chance that the teeth on the other end of the starter are bent, or the torque limiter is bent. So that means that the cam cover, the inner cam cover may have to come off, just so I can inspect that to make sure that when I do put a new starter on there, that it's able to actually connect in to that gear. And when you try to turn the bike over, it's actually gonna turn like it's supposed to and not shred off inside the motor. Yeah, and then there's the oil filter that's bent and the rectifier that's bent, which means that the oil filter adapter where the oil filter actually bolts onto, that could also be messed up that I need to check. Honestly, that's not that big of a deal. I feel like the frame is gonna be the hardest thing to get sorted, but this frame will be headed to Atlanta to a frame shop to get corrected. The only issue I'm having right now is that you need a rolling chassis. And what that means is that the front and the rear wheel needs to be on so they can roll it up on the jig and, you know, put it in the vices and everything and kind of bend it where it needs to be. I don't have a front end that I can put on this bike. I do have a front end on the Super Chief, but I do not want to touch that bike because the front end is completely intact. That bike was not in a wreck. I don't want to mess with that bike. That bike is complete. So right now I'm missing a front end. I do have the bent forks over here that I technically could rebuild, but I don't want to spend the money on it. But a few months ago, probably 3-4 months ago now, I actually bought a rolling chassis from another company. They basically buy these bikes and they take the motors out of them and they build custom bikes. And they sold me the frame and the wheels. It came with front suspension, subframe, front and rear fenders, rear swing arm, tires, everything. It's a rolling piece just without the motor, the wiring, and all the extra little stuff. The problem is, it's in Connecticut, and I am waiting for them to bring it kind of halfway to a mutual friend's location so I can kind of go get it and then bring it back, take the fork legs off, and then slap it on here, because I could put the old pieces back on, but you need to have true pieces because that's what they're gonna be bending the frame back to. Because basically they're gonna be checking the measurements on the frame, like the wheelbase and in different areas, to make sure that when they put it in there, they can bend it back to that exact specification, which means that if it's the wheelbase is correct and the other few measurements, then that means that they got it back to where it needs to be. But it just has to be in a movable state so they can verify that the front suspension, rear suspension, and everything is where it needs to be. So right now this bike is just sitting here. It's collecting spiders and dust, and I have taken a few parts off of it to build the other bikes, but this bike will not become a parts bike. It would not become a parts bike. I'm gonna say that again, because I have a vision for this bike. It's just, this is throwing a curveball at me, and this motor is throwing a curveball at me, because visually when I looked at it, when I bought it, I did not know that this was gonna be the issue. However, had I seen this and knew about this before I bought it, I honestly probably would have still bought it, because once I understand how to get frames corrected, and once I understand how to get certain things welded or do it myself, that means that when I see these bikes out there, I won't be afraid of them. I can go ahead and get them because I know how to have them fixed. So I'm kind of glad that I am going through this process, but I do have some cool projects that I want to do with this bike. Actually, let me show you this. Oh, this Victory Magnum stuff over here. Oh my God. Okay, all right, okay. For a few months, I've been messing around with composite material, and I had this vision for Indian Chief where a lot of these parts are like carbon fiber. So I'm a big fan of Formula One, and those cars are built from ground up with so much carbon fiber in mind, lightweight material, performance, aerodynamics, and everything. And I just looked at it like, I wonder if I can make parts out of carbon fiber. So this is the original piece that mounts here on the side, right? That piece goes like that. So the piece that I made purely out of carbon is this piece. Now granted, it's not perfect. It has some imperfections, but it fits directly. Whoa, that's a huge spider up under there. Oh my Jesus. Wow, that is a huge spider. Holy cow, I did not expect that thing to be there. Yeah, please don't move while I film this. So yeah, it sits right there directly in line. And what's cool about this is that not only is it an exact replica, but this piece I think weighs, I can't remember the exact measurements, but maybe 40% less than the original metal piece. And it's durable as far as tensile strength. And of course, this is just a side panel piece. But once you add like gloss to it, you know, some kind of clear coat, it'll look, you know, like authentic carbon fiber. But this is considered forged carbon. The only reason I don't have another one of these is because I broke the mold. These are the mold pieces. That's the male side, and this is the female side. You can see I actually cracked it. And the thing is, it is very expensive to pour these molds. And you know, I tried like 3 or 4 different times, and it was like $100 a pour. So I haven't perfected the process down. You can see where I tried to do the ignition cover, and it just completely split through. Yeah, so these are very heavy, but I was able to make one piece, and that was enough. The bike is currently sitting on the kickstand, but mostly on a jack stand under the right floorboard. So it's at a halt right now. And once I get either that frame with the suspension, the front suspension, or if I decide to go ahead and rebuild the forks that I have, which might cost, you know, $1,000, maybe $1,500, I'm gonna get this thing situated and we're gonna get it fixed. Because I do still want to get it powder coated a different color. I have really big plans for this, but between the carbon fiber thing and getting the frame corrected, then getting the motor fixed, it's just gonna take some time. And plus the space in here is just getting absolutely ridiculous with the Victory Magnum, the Super Chief, and then we got the Chief Dark Horse coming back. Then we have the 109 still, we got Chieftain in here, and then we got other projects that I wanna start on. But this bike, it would not get lost. I'm just letting you guys know that this is becoming a test bed for various things. And it is gonna be a pet project. It's gonna be probably cams, it's gonna be like, you know, new wiring harness I'm experimenting with, new ECUs that I want to experiment with, carbon fiber composite that I want to experiment with. We got different wheels on here. At some point, I want to get to the point with composites where I can make a carbon fiber motorcycle frame. That's really what I want to get to, but it costs money to do that. Carbon fiber is very expensive to get past that learning curve, but it's just something that's just going to take time. But this is where Super Chief is, Super Chief Limited. It has a bent frame. It has a cracked motor case that's not leaking in that spot. It just needs to be welded, and there's various different components that we're gonna have to address at some point. But compared to the first Indian Chief Dark Horse or the second one that we completely rebuilt from ground up, this one won't be too far off from that. And as far as the challenge, you guys know I'm willing to figure it out and take it. So that's the story on it. If you're subscribed, yeah, I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.